Thank you, everybody, for participating and joining in the College of Arts and Humanities Speaker Series. We hope that the seminars provide information and entertainment regarding our research, teaching, and creative work in the college and pique your interest and increase your participation. Don't forget to invite your friends to come to the seminars and take action afterwards. Today we have the UCF Center for Ethics with Drs. Jonathan Beever and Stephen Kuebler. And next week we have Connie Lester, Dr. Connie Lester from the History Department, talking about Bending Toward Justice project she's doing with UCF Center for Humanities and Digital Research, or also known as CHDR, or Cheddar. The week after, Dr. Stella Sung and the staff from the Center for Research and Education in Arts, Technology, and Entertainment, also known as UCF Create, will be discussing the community work they're doing from UCF downtown. So don't forget to sign up for those and participate as well. Today's talk via Zoom will be about 30 to 40 minutes, give or take a few, with active participation from the audience. Dialogue is definitely encouraged. We ask that when you're not actively engaging in conversation, that you keep your audio on mute to reduce background noise. Notice the Zoom controls. They should come up on your screen in just a second. For raise hand in the participants, there you go, in the participants window at the bottom of your screen, that you can also see in the PowerPoint slide in front of you, so you can see what the controls are. We'll use this today during the conversation between Drs. Beever and Kuebler and the Q&A session. They both, Stephen and Jonathan, encourage conversations with all of you. So if you'd like to chime in at any time, use the raise hand function and they'll call on you to join in, at which point you should unmute yourself. During the Q&A, use the chat box where you can either type your question into the chat box and a moderator will ask the question for you, for those who would like to do it that way and don't want to speak on their own, or type, "I have a question," to be called on. And remember, always be respectful. Disruptors, with our very, very helpful moderators, disruptors also known as Zoom bombers, will be removed from the program so the conversation can proceed. We're planning on a lively and interesting discussion, and your participation makes all the difference. Remember too that today's presentation, just like our others that we have in the seminar series, will be posted on the CA YouTube account and shared at cah.ucf.edu/seminars. By turning on your video and speaking, you consent to being included in this recording. So thank you for joining us today, and I'll turn it over to Jonathan and Stephen, who I'm sure have some really interesting stuff to talk about the Center for Ethics and the activities that they're engaged in. So there you go.
Thank you, Dr. Stanlick, and thanks everybody for being here. Steve and I are just going to go back and forth for a few minutes to share some framing ideas about the center, a little bit of background, things we're working on. And as Nancy said, you should feel free to interrupt us with questions at any point. We'd love this to turn into a discussion. And it doesn't need to be super serious either. We were asked to present or talk with you a little bit about the Center for Ethics in this AHA moment, AHA seminar series that CH is running. And I think Steve and I, as we were talking about what the center could contribute to this conversation, we both decided that we see ethics as sort of a premier AHA situation. I think a lot of times we make a distinction between reactive approaches to ethics and proactive approaches to ethics. And it's a pretty simple distinction, but one we see as vitally important. I think normally we wait until things go wrong, or maybe the wrong becomes obvious before we act react in response to it. And it's much harder to think in advance, to be proactive. So again, we usually react to ethical issues rather than being proactive against them. And that's, I think, for any number of reasons, one of which is just it takes a lot of energy to engage proactively in thinking about ethics when we have not enough energy to spread around, especially in moments like this one. And I think this focus we have about ethics, this sort of orientation around trying to be proactive in ethics, really situates in a much larger social context too, whether it's about Black, Indigenous, and people of color, or police, issues or wealth distribution or artificial intelligence or big data tech or the environment, these big problems of harms, injustice, or value conflicts to which we're now just kind of responding really ought to be proactively addressed. And I think the contemporary sort of social unrest moment in which we're situated right now and the pandemic moment have exemplified that. And I think many more people are looking at ways we can be proactive. How that will turn out is a different question, but I think with institutions, centers like ours at UCF, we can be a hub for thinking proactively about ethics. And I think that big social picture is also very true for local situations here at UCF. So whether the center has had very much impact in it as young as it is so far, we see the center's role as helping the university think through those big ethics issues, whether it's about sort of optics issues, like how the university is perceived by others, or whether it's taking up ethics in our research and our curriculum. We're hoping that we can help our colleagues be better equipped to deal with it, our colleagues and our administration. So we see ethics as something that has to be at the forefront of training and education for the next generation of both citizens and scholars. And we want our faculty colleagues and our institutional leaders to be capable of cultivating that skill of ethical decision-making or ethical awareness even in our students. And I think it's, the other thing Steve and I talked about before we started this morning was we don't, I think generally speaking, we don't appreciate a focus on ethics until we realize we're lacking it. And I think that's a pretty powerful idea to internalize. So since its launch last year, Dr. Kuebler and I, as leaders of the Center for Ethics, have held faculty workshops and graduate discussions and supported advocacy in our departments and our communities and worked to lead through example. And we'll talk about much more of that as we go ahead. Dr. Kuebler?
Great. Thank you. Well, I want to add my voice welcoming everyone to this workshop. We really appreciate your time and your interest. And at the very front, what I want to say is, I agree this should be a discussion. We need lots of ideas for our center, and the very essence of the center's goal is to foster conversations about ethics, and I'll define that. But that means we hope to have ideas coming from the very broad community of all of UCF and the community that we serve. So this conversation and the activities that are part of it should be understood to be institutional wide. Much of what we are hoping to do will be research focused, either research that Jonathan and I conduct or that is done with students, but also research that you as interested parties in ethics might want to engage in. There's research connected to ethics happens all across the institution. And there's some obvious connections, for instance, maybe in the psychology department. We can imagine how people are understanding cognitive processes and how that connects to ethics, but also within the sciences, way on the other side of the house, in our day-to-day routines, for me as a scientist and my students, there are, on the micro scale, ethical decisions that we make at each moment when we design an experiment or figure out how to process data, and understanding a distinction, for instance, between things like manipulating data versus processing data to get to a larger truth. So we want to explore how ethics permeates all of what we do at the university, and then understand how that kind of conversation and research can actually benefit other stakeholders, our alumni, organizations and companies within our community. So this very much is about the UCF community writ large and how we can serve. The Center for Ethics is a university level center, which means that our activities report directly to the VP for Research, Liz Klonoff, and she helps us manage the center and frequently provides input on ways that we can diversify our activities. But the center, I should roll back to 2004 and earlier, is very much a brainchild of the philosophy department and the College of Arts and Humanities. And one of the things that I push with my students, I know many of us do, is as we learn things, we really stand on the shoulders of giants. And there's too many giants in the philosophy department for me to name individually whose work started in the early 2000s. really helped to lead to the center. So there was a formal launch of the center only recently, but the concept of a center for ethics, in particular, it being an interdisciplinary function or having an interdisciplinary function, is very broadly refined by some of the thinkers in the philosophy department and some of you who are actually participants here. To get the center going, one of the things that we needed, of course, was support, and we had very early support in addition from the College of Arts and Humanities, from the College of Sciences and the College of Engineering. So Dr. Jana Jasinski and Dr. Michael Johnson were very helpful to us in trying to think about ways that what we could do with an ethics research focus, CUM Ethics Center, how that could relate to the STEM fields. It's quite obvious how it might fit into education and majors associated with arts and humanities, but maybe less obvious how it could be integrated into education and research in the STEM fields. And that's one of the things that I really hope to help facilitate as someone who comes from the chemistry and optics discipline. So we're very much about cross-disciplinary collaborations, and we look toward you for lots of input on how we can do that. Maybe there are research activities that you are engaged in that could leverage some of the capabilities from the Center for Ethics. So Jonathan hinted at some of the different activities that we're engaging in. Leading workshops is one function that in the lead up to the center was at the forefront. And these were workshops that we led with students. Some of those are through formal structures like the Graduate College's Pathways to Success program. But we've also held workshops for faculty at college and department levels and for administrators. And these are fascinating because they really end up highlighting some of the interesting nuance of ethics, that you can have extremely reasonable people all together, even from the same discipline, who can have different ideas about how things are done or should be done. And some of these things come to light in the workshops, and they really provide the fodder for research. These are things that we can study and potentially study empirically. And so in the last year, we have launched some student-grounded research and research done with undergraduates and graduate students. We've taken data from our workshops with the Graduate College and assessed what students' perceptions about ethics are, and done the same with faculty. And we're hoping to use that to do a number of things. One is to understand what the ethics landscape is at UCF. How is ethics explicitly and implicitly taught? What is our emphasis on ethics? And hopefully, can we understand how that's translating into the high quality students that we produce and what they do in their career paths? And then we've recently begun presenting some of that research in national forums, such as the Association for Practical and Professional Ethics meetings. Jonathan, for a long time, has been very involved with the American Society for Engineering Education and the National Academy of Engineering, and has introduced me to many of the leaders in that group. And we're trying to disseminate some of the research that we're doing at the local level, primarily to understand our local situation and help cultivate a culture at UCF, but also to maybe define paradigms by which others at other universities or institutions can apply and begin to understand their ethics landscape and how to cultivate it. And then all of these activities, of course, need some sort of support to keep the gears turning. And so some of our activities also include looking to private donors or companies that might be interested in sponsoring activities, and of course, writing proposals for extramural support from organizations like the National Science Foundation. So Jonathan will tell you about some of the recent events that we've had with outside speakers.
Yeah, thanks, Steve. We've really been trying to be active in engaging the campus community, feeding back into some of the research and passion about ethics that Steve and I share. We've hosted several university level lecture events, including Lisa Lee, who was President Obama's director of the Presidential Commission for Bioethical Issues. So she helped us launch the center back last fall, talking about ethical leadership with us. You'll see a video of that talk up on our website pretty soon. And then this past spring, second semester of the center's existence, a colleague of mine, Jonathan Marks from Penn State, who just written a book called The Perils of Partnership, came to UCF to talk with us specifically about that book and about both the good and the bad that can come from industry level partnerships with public institutions. His talk was really interesting, as was Lisa's. And well attended, and both of those will be available for you to watch on our website through our our coming YouTube stream pretty soon. We've also been involved, both Steve and I separately and together have been involved in various task forces across campus, whether that's crisis management or use of student data. And we've been trying to engage at the institutional level, even about back to campus policies and other policies coming out from the administration through open comment. I'd like to see the center in the future become more, be taken up, be seen more as a resource to help in policy discussions at the university. But again, as a center, we're quite young, so I think we're still working on those details. And then we've finally been connecting with community industry partners, specifically around issues of ethics and entertainment. And so there's a lot of things going on, but just to reiterate a point Steve said, I think some of my favorite work that we've done so far has been with our students. So we're actively engaged with 3 students, one of which is here with us now, on 3 different research projects that will all be student-driven but peer-reviewed article-length publications by the end of the summer. And I'm really encouraged by that work because these are passionate students from across disciplines on campus who are bringing their interest in ethics to us and bringing a disciplinary expertise that I don't have to bear on our work. And I think that's really encouraging. And a lot of that research came out of what we started calling the Ethics Ambassadors Program. It's a group of students and colleagues, many of whom are here with us today, who meet or were meeting bi-weekly with the Center for Ethics. The pandemic has thrown that for a little bit of a loop, and we're trying to get back on with some virtual presentations. But the Ambassadors Network is really important because, again, that gives a point of access to colleagues across campus who just want an opportunity to talk with others about ethics on campus, to get a sense of what we're working on and find ways to connect. So that's a bi-weekly opportunity. We just have a calendar invite that we share with everyone who's interested. And so we can talk more about that in the Q&A too.
So we mentioned that we've been doing research in ethics with students and on student behavior. And as Jonathan said, the students that we meet who are doing the research especially are very passionate about the subject of ethics. But so too are the students that come to the graduate workshops and other forums where we've been able to actually collect data for our research across the board. Students are extremely passionate about the subject of ethics. They think it's very important, and they think it's connected directly to their professional paths, even if they are seemingly far removed from ethics or philosophy. Scientists, for instance, end up making up the majority of some of the students that we have in our workshops, and across the board, they're very interested in the concept of ethics. In some ways, maybe that's a no-brainer. We know that the Gen Z group, for instance, is very interested in public issues and society and so forth. But then the question is, how does that translate into action? And so that's an outstanding question that I'll mention later. We've also similarly gathered data and opinion from faculty. And faculty are interesting in that they too are very interested in ethics and think it's extremely important. And yet it depends really upon how you define ethics when you ask about their interests. Because unfortunately, in some cases, ethics has a dirty word, or is a dirty word. It's equated with compliance, the idea that there are rules and rules you must follow, and everyone recognizes you have rules. But rules often translate into bureaucracies and gates that are closed as opposed to opportunities for doing things in the right way. And nobody wants more training, and so it becomes hard sometimes to get faculty to be excited about the idea of ethics until they understand that what we're talking about really is ethics in the context of professional conduct and among students, or their opportunity to cultivate professional conduct among students. Then faculty are really engrossed in the conversation. So, you know, that's an interesting hurdle potentially, because in order for us to really spread the word about ethics and cultivate it, especially among our students, faculty have to be engaged, and we have to be able to look at and research and understand how best to bring ethics into a classroom. There's lots of work that's going on well outside of UCF in this area. How do we best teach ethics and the principles of ethics to people in STEM, for example? Is it better that they, you know, at the lowest level take a class in philosophy on ethics, or does it need to be taught within the discipline? Or do you need a hybrid approach? And, you know, those are very complicated questions. because it depends upon what the focus is. And yet students and faculty and administrators think that ethics is something that's very important to have in the curriculum. And you even hear that on the outside. You know, you don't have to but turn on the news any evening and you find some example where ethical principles have been violated. And so we have to believe that by focusing on ethics and learning about value judgment and, you know, how to do things right, why we have rules and some of these underlying concepts, we might be able to help create a generation that's more focused on ethical behavior so the bad things don't happen. That's certainly one of the goals.
Yeah, what Steve's talking about, I've developed a kind of hobby horse about this, but I see a really a significant tension between compliance and ethics, especially at institutions like ours, research institutions in particular. But the idea that we can just solve ethical issues or avoid ethical issues through complying with a set of rules or regulations is not the direction we think is the right one to go in terms of ethics. Rules have an important place, as compliance infrastructures have an important place, but the tension, I think, is around this idea of an ethics culture. So how is it that some organizations or some groups end up working together well in an ethical sense and others don't? And where do those tensions arise and how are they resolved and how can we be proactive against them? It's that sort of big picture question is a real driver for my own thinking about ethics. Some of my early work, even a long time ago as a graduate student, was thinking about responsible cognitive research and that same distinction. So in what ways can we just train graduate students to understand what the parameters and rules around, say, handling of human subjects research data or authorship or mentorship collaborations? If we just train them in the rules surrounding those, will they understand the ethical issues behind them? And it seems pretty obvious to us that the answer is no. And yet we face this problem of curricular space and time and faculty expertise. So trying to find the place for faculty to have, and students together, to have conversations about ethics alongside while they're doing their jobs and being good technicians and also complying with existing rules is difficult. But again, it's part of the reason that the Center for Ethics exists.
So one of the things that, on a personal level, I'm learning is how exciting and vibrant this research field is and so many of the challenges. Coming from the chemistry tradition, my modality of experimenting is put it in the beaker, control all the variables and see what comes out. You can't do that in the social science research, right? It's almost like you have to use epidemiological models in order to study some things. And that comes to ethics as well. How could we ever measure and know whether we have an ethical culture or are fostering an ethical culture? And that's something I think that is an open-ended question. And I would love to hear ideas from you as participants. How can we longitudinally assess and measure the impact of the center? I think there may be some ways to do that in a short term and in a microscopic sense, where you have maybe research groups and take students in and cultivate them enculturate them in ethics, and then study how language changes as they think about research and assess problems. And yet what you really want to know is, are you having an effect over the longer term? So it's easy to find the data that tells us when there's been an ethical shortfall. And yet what methods do we have to collect data that allow us to see where people are behaving ethically, because you don't necessarily hear about those situations. And then how do you connect that and correlate it with training and backgrounds? And so that's an outstanding question for us, because we want to know if we're doing a good job, and we want to know how to do it better, and we want to develop models that we can disseminate to others.
And I think it's not only an outstanding question for us, but it's an outstanding question for ethics in general. Everybody who's thinking about ethics asks that same question about assessment or evaluation. Yeah, I think these are really important problems. So everyone, the College of Arts and Humanities had asked us to make sure we offered you a takeaway. And if you take one thing away besides my little hobby horse and some of the other things we've said, it's that I think it's that the Center for Ethics here at UCF is about supporting this idea of an ethical culture. And we see it as something that has to be grounded in faculty-led research and action. So our goal is to cultivate that, is to stimulate a community of faculty colleagues and students who can help us live up to our motto of doing well and be better. And so we are happy to talk about anything we've discussed so far, and we've got some follow-up questions we can ask you if you don't have any questions for us.
Yeah, so we'll open up the floor here to questions. Bruce Jantz raised his hand, seems to have a question.
Yeah, thanks. First, thanks so much, Jonathan and Stephen, for your work on this. I mean, I think this is a really necessary initiative, and I'm glad to see the two of you, especially from different disciplines, taking leadership on this. So I'm interested in the idea of you know, ethics as related to culture, which you brought up. You know, I mean, the root of the word is an ethos, you know, and you know, it's you know, this center forms at a time at UCF when there were ethical questions raised about certain things that happened in overall, you know, institutional culture, you know, connected to Trevor Coburn Hall's construction, connected to a host of other kinds of things. And so I guess I'm interested, and maybe this connects to the question of you know, assessment, like how do you assess the success of something? I'm wondering if trying to assess it actually undermines the success of it. In other words, if operationalizing things and saying, okay, we have made progress in these areas actually undermines the building of a culture where there's, for example, things like trust. You know, because it seems to me a kind of basis for trust would go a long way towards building a culture that has kind of the positive version of ethics that you're talking about. So how do you work with that tension?
Well, I can make some comments to that. I think, you know, culture as a word, there's a lot to unpack there, because for many people thinking about ethics and culture, they might think, oh, culture as in country of origin, which is not what you meant, or they could mean culture in terms of discipline, which is also not what you meant, but it's more about origins or tradition. And really what you're implying is at an institutional level, is there a tradition, you know, that underpins or that can be defined as ethical or unethical? I recognize and acknowledge your point about assessment as being fundamentally flawed insofar as soon as you develop a metric, people may chase the metric and then it undermines other important outcomes that you might hope to see. And I think that is an inherent tension. We're all aware of it. We had a back and forth just this morning about incentives for research, not connected to our project, but another, where I saw what I thought was a good idea and put it out to my team members, and they pointed out one of the limits in that approach, and we had a great back and forth. And I think what it comes down to is that if you don't measure, you won't know, and yet measurement has to be very carefully constructed. And so the question might be, we agree that we have to have measurement, but who will do the measuring and who will define the metrics? And so I think too often the metrics are defined by an entity that's not connected to the problem or the challenge, or doesn't understand it. It could be, you know, at an administrative level or an extra institutional level. But the question is, are all stakeholders involved in defining the metric? Certainly you got to measure something. I come from an empirical tradition and I want to measure it. At the same time, although it may not be obvious, in my own empirical tradition, there's many qualitative things that I want to measure in my optics research, performance of a device. And I wrestle with that frustration as well. So this work and the challenges that you mentioned are really a very natural extension for me. And my tradition has been know when you don't know and ask others. And so what I'm suggesting is we really have to reach out to others and get information and to generate any kind of a measurement, whether it's knowing that we're ethical in how we handle institutional money, or whether we're measuring our ability to cultivate culture or educate students well. We have to have a larger group at the table constructing the metrics and the measurement tools. Beyond that, the challenge remains.
And this is why I love working with Steve, because he keeps me grounded in the empirical. And my response, Bruce, I think is somewhat different. I spent, so last summer, about this time last summer, I was in DC, invited to a workshop on ethics assessment with 30 of the brightest minds in the country and me. about this topic, and there was no resolution, right? It's not like we came up with the plan to assess ethics and what are we assessing? What skills do people need to make ethical decisions well, to work in communities well, to rebuild trust relationships in strong ways? There's all sorts of minutia that one could assess. And my instinct maybe follows your own in that assessing ethics isn't the point. The point is building relationships and building trust. And I mean, you're a great example of this. So just so everybody knows, like I wouldn't be working with Dr. Kuebler right now if it wasn't for Dr. Jentz. Because when I arrived at the university in 2015, Bruce, you invited me to meet Steve in the context of his ethics class in optics. And that got me working with Steve. And that's the way ethics cultures build. It's not that somebody says, oh, we put this, and I say this in jest because I think it's also important, but we didn't hire a company to do a survey of an ethics culture and then we figured out we're on the right track. Like that doesn't matter as a matter of fact, right? And it might, as you're suggesting, Bruce, I think you're suggesting, it might even undermine trust a little bit, but it's about building relationships. And so I see assessment as really important in the context of research and funding, right? Our funding agencies need to, and our institutions need a metric to measure our success. So even the Center for Ethics, and Dr. Stanley helped me and Steve to design an assessment rubric for the center when we first proposed it. So we've got our own metrics to measure our own success. But even if we meet those metrics, it doesn't mean we're changing the ethics culture. So they're kind of two different things. And I lean to the side of relationships.
Mm-hmm. Thanks, those are great answers.
I would add just one thing to that. I think I'll be the first to raise my hand and say, I hate assessments. I hate assessing myself and doing my annual report at the end of the year. And yet when I come out of the process, I go, oh, I did some stuff. I actually accomplished some things. Maybe next year I can do X, Y, Z. And so in some ways, assessment ought to be more about self-reflection and being able to chart paths internally as opposed to just meeting goals. So in that context, I think assessment, dirty word as it might be, it has value.
Thanks.
Yeah, so Darren asked us a really interesting question too in the chat window. So Darren's asking about a question we get that I see all the time from my students and my colleagues both. Yeah, a lot of the times when we think about ethics, if we take it to be this idea that it's values intersecting or connecting, right? That you've got your values and I've got mine, and then we have to go through some negotiative, democratic, deliberative process. And there are models of ethics that are just like that. But and so, Darren, you're not at all wrong in your question. So you're asking if we're measuring this sort of democratic, majority-driven view of ethics, who determines what's right and what's correct? That's a really tricky, perennial question in ethics, right? Is it just that the right and the good are determined by those in control? That's a terrifying view on my thought. And we've seen, I think we live in a moment where those views are pretty prevalent, right? But I can't believe that to be the case. Philosophers like myself and a lot of people in this meeting would give you a good response about the dangers of ethical relativism, for instance, which we can rehash at a later time. But the idea that we do work together to resolve value conflicts, I think is spot on. But I think we share some values, or at least some principles around values that guide everybody's actions in the same way to the same extent. The work is what bioethicists have called like specifying and prioritizing those values, balancing those values. But I just don't want to give up the idea that there is a right and a good out there that we can strive together towards. And that striving together is a really pragmatic idea, I think. So yeah, you're right that we have to be really careful when we're thinking about assessment or measurement of ethics, that we're looking at the power relationships built into it, right? Who's designing the assessment tool? What are their value objectives? What are their orientations? Are they counterbalanced by to get some sort of objectivity or neutrality of the discussion? So I think that's the right question to ask. But again, I'd caution us all against a like relativist stance where anything goes. That's a scary world. And Victoria's asked us a good question too. So Victoria writes, when you said you're seeing Gen Z pay more attention to ethics, do you think it's truly an interest in ethics, or is it holding people, institutions, and companies accountable for their actions or promises? or maybe they're interrelated, she says. What do you
Yeah,
think, Steve?
my instinct is they're certainly interrelated. I think maybe in the short term, it's about accountability. Who done me wrong? Why are we doing it this way? But I think it morphs into a broader focus on ethics, societal structure, communities. Harkening back to the previous question, should everything be necessarily driven by a majority? If you have a majority outcome, does that make it ethical, or is it more about the process? Did the majority look at its impact on a minority or on outside groups in order to reach a decision? Is a majority whether it be voters or customers or individuals in a country from which raw materials are taken, or a county where manufacturing is done, is there consideration given to how those processes are going to impact people? If you don't have that process in place and looking at those value judgments, it wouldn't matter what your outcome is. It's not necessarily going to be ethical, because it's much about how a decision is reached, as in how many people agree with that particular decision.
Yeah, I completely agree. And I think I will, if it's okay, call out my colleagues, JJ Rodriguez and Lakeland Taylor, both students who come from a different generation than I do. They might have a perspective or their own perspective on this question, which I'd love to hear if they're willing to share it, either by chat or by video.
Please.
Sorry, Lakeland and JJ, to put you on the spot, but I value your opinions.
Yeah, and others can always jump in. We can come back to some of those topics.
Yeah, I think it's a really important question. Again, just to reiterate Victoria's question, it's whether younger generations, Gen Z, Victoria says, whether they're really attentive to ethics, and we can talk about what that means, or if they're just responding to questions of accountability that are made obvious by the media and other sources.
I can answer a little bit if.
Go for it, Lakeland. Yeah, please.
So hello everyone, I'm Lakeland. Not an expert on anything, so don't let them fool you. But
it's okay.
But as far as just what I think about that question, I think it's a both and sort of thing, right? So I think that younger generations are concerned with ethics, especially where it concerns issues like social justice, and especially when it concerns their relationship with their professors and with people that they're researching under, right? Because I think that what graduate students, especially, like, so speaking from my own experience, speaking from the graduate student perspective, the ethical issues that we're facing now are a little different than just don't plagiarize, although that's still like a very important one, right? But our ethical issues come in at, okay, well, my supervising professor is like requiring me to work 60 hours a week. What do I do? Or an international student who says my green card or my visa is being used against me to do, all this labor, and I'm not necessarily getting paid for it, or I'm not getting paid to do this much. So the ethical issues, I think, are different, and I think this is like students care about those things and hearing how to navigate those ethical dilemmas as they graduate from not going back to basics is always important, right? But from okay, what does it mean to cite your sources correctly, or or why are we doing that? So I do think it's a both and sort of thing, if that answers the.
Yeah, I'll add to that. That's a really neat topic that you expressed, because it's come out when we have done workshops with faculty. And it's something that's, also come out in workshops with administrators. On the faculty side is, what is my relationship to my student? Think about responsibilities. How do you get students to understand the importance of the hard work that they need to do, and yet balancing that against life balance needs? And administrators will hear the bad stories of the faculty that is working the student too hard, or perhaps doing something abusive and have concerns about helping to cultivate more responsible behavior on the part of faculty. So it's definitely a conversation that is being had and that has emerged in our workshops. And I think, you know, I don't think there's an obvious answer, but I think sometimes the conversation is a little bit too myopically focused. Often the perspectives and or I guess the overlap between the perspectives is not clear. Faculty will sometimes take the perspective of, well, it's not about work hours, it's really about getting a free education. It's really about, you know, putting in the time in order to get to the degree. But how that comes across or how that is manifest in a group culture can be very different from supervisor to supervisor. So as I have done graduate workshops, almost everyone I've done, I've heard a story or two from a graduate student that really feels that they're in an abusive environment. There can be many reasons for that, but it is more commonly from international students. And so I think faculty are often not aware of how vast that power differential is and how their behavior can seem to be, whether intended or not, can seem to be exploitative of that power differential. So I think it's an important topic that's got to be fleshed out more.
Yeah, I completely agree. And to take it from the 100-foot view to the 10,000-foot view, I think graduate students who start to recognize those issues in their own relationships with, say, mentors or colleagues or the institution, then the next step in their becoming ethically literate is to see that they're a microcosm of a bigger issue of graduate students more generally, and that graduate students are representative of larger social issues. And I think of that sort of expanding moral circle idea, that your issues are issues that faced by others, and those issues are driven by other factors. Like ethics all of a sudden becomes big and takes on legs and grows and becomes something that's part and parcel of the way you live your lives every day. And I think that effort to help our students and our colleagues become literate in ethics, to develop ethics literacy, is essential. I think it's vitally important to the health of the institution. And again, to circle back around, I mean, to get to an ethics culture, it's about building those relationships, right? So Lakeland, whether it's you talking to your colleague graduate students about their issues, and then talking to your faculty colleagues about those issues, and then faculty talk to each other, and those are the relationships that build this idea of literacy across an institution. And I think that's at the heart of an ethics culture. I know we've only got a couple of minutes left. I think we were told we've got a 1:45 stop this afternoon. So we'd love to hear from other folks if you've got questions for us or want to weigh in on this attention to ethics question. Oh, Victoria tells us we get to keep going until 2. So
Great.
We can keep going. That's great. Are there other questions or concerns for us? If we didn't talk about this, Steve, but I had an ethical issue that I wondered if I could talk with you about, and everybody else. So a couple of three organizations that national level organizations I'm involved with have all now released or are releasing basically support statements for the social movements that are going on right now in the US. And it's so interesting to me that in each of those, I've tried to add language about the importance of listening. And this relationship between acting in solidarity while not acting on behalf of, while listening, I think that tension is one that we live in right now. And we live it not only in issues of social unrest that are going on right now, but I think we live it in issues of the pandemic. Like, we've got national level scientific leaders giving us the best evidence they can provide about best practices concerning COVID-19, many of which are being ignored by way too many people, especially here in our state. And again, this tension between acting and listening, I think, is one that's really important. And it's not really a question, but I wondered if anybody had thoughts about where that tension lives in their own lives. Because I've felt it sitting at home here, working from home over the past few months, felt it intently. Like, should I be doing something different than I am? How do I listen well as an advocate and as a supporter? And I struggle. So anyway, I'd love to hear more.
Yeah, I would like to know if anyone has a comment on that tension that you described in their own experience. I will say, I think one of the challenges is that listening is a great word and concept. It's what you hope to have to maybe alleviate some of the tension, and yet embedded within that word is, to me, is that it's not really actionable, that you weren't listening unless you came over to my viewpoint. Really what it is about maybe competing values coming to play and finding generating policy or generating a way forward that balances against those values. And if either party seems to think that their value is not reflected enough in the outcome, then the claim can be you simply didn't listen. And so really what makes the outcome reflect listening, and is listening really actionable? I think maybe it goes to a deeper level of is the process where the listening and the talking and the discussing happening, recognizing things like expertise and experience. So when you talk about scientists issuing statements about maybe how COVID should be treated and maybe they're not being listened to, maybe what's underlying it is that coming to the process, there's not necessarily a trust of expertise or an acknowledgement of expertise. And so that's kind of an underlying problem. So I think the tension's there, and I don't know necessarily how to diffuse it. But I think that's one of the challenges that we have. And to me, I see that as a connection to ethics. You have an ethical obligation in addressing something to communicate and get information. And often that means reaching out to people with expertise and not challenging things in an ad hoc way when you don't yourself have that expertise. That doesn't mean blindly following with faith. But it means weighing evidence, and it means seeking out those that can provide evidence through expertise and method that they've developed.
Yeah, I like that, Stephen. And to me, it circles back around to Darren's initial question about sort of democratic-driven ethics. I mean, if there's a sense in which everybody can have their own values, but those values are so tightly coupled to epistemic conditions or conditions about what we know, that there's a important essential place for expertise. Like knowledge has to be validated of the right kind, and that takes expertise. And then if that's coupled then to values, you're off and running. But too often, I think there's this decoupling that happens. Dominique says she completely agrees. Listening and actions go hand in hand. I've been active in the social movement, and I've noticed that listening has been the weakest aspect of the movement. I've noticed many changes that are progressive, but not necessarily addressing the main concern. Yeah, and I will admit, Dominique, like I found my own positioning in that conversation to be a real point of my own personal tensions. Like, how do I listen well, but also be supportive in the right way? And there are ways to do that. And the ways that I found to do that are to turn to my colleagues who do this professionally, right? Who can help me. I turn to expertise. So I think back to Steve's point, that's really important.
Jonathan Ian Piazzo writes on another topic, should or could assessments be personal and subjective based on personal change to avoid the moral, relativistic, or majority-driven assessment structure? And I think the answer is yes, that's an important part of it. It's very insightful. And it really gets to understanding not maybe over the long term whether ethics enculturation has had an impact. Does a person just behave ethically thereafter? But in the short term, it lets you maybe get a sense or a measure of, is the person listening? Is the person thinking about the value conflicts? Jonathan has taught me a lot about this concept of value framing, and I really enjoy it. It's a construct where you start to understand or tease out what are the fundamental values that come into conflict when faced with an ethical dilemma. Do we shelter in place, or do we open up to get the economy going? You know, those are two competing values. How do we begin to assess that and ask the right questions in order to make the right decisions? And I guess in the short term, to your point, Ian, you can ask, are people thinking in a subjective way about those questions? If they are, that's maybe half the battle won. They're half the way toward an ethical outcome if the individual is thinking in that way.
Yeah, and I think there might be a fun physics metaphor buried in there too, right? So if Ian's looking at sort of self-assessment, personal and subjective assessment, you could assess yourself riding on a train moving really quickly, right? Or assess yourself vis-a-vis some external point of reference. And I think this is the game of ethics. If we're self-assessing just based on our own value frameworks or our own value framing, we can see ourselves as moving or not moving, just based on what's happening with that one point of reference. So I think the perspective taking approach to ethics is really important. The more points of reference we have, we can start to see vectors of change. Now I'm getting way too physicsy, but you can start to see or directionality to our change, and we can assess ourselves vis-a-vis others and vis-a-vis other structures. And I think that's the way, again, maybe to do ethics democratically, but still oriented in some direction. So you've got to have sort of the local, the personal assessment, but also I think there needs to be an external, not necessarily external to the construct, but some more or less stable frame of ethics. I'm getting myself into the weeds here, and I'm thinking my head spinning about normative theory and metaethics, but I think I'm on the right track there. We should definitely talk more.
I think you are too. Bruce Jantz has a very topical comment. He says, I agree with Dominique. In the Black Lives Matter protests recently, we've had all sorts of attempts to show that people in power have listened. And ironically, they usually demonstrate that they haven't. Black Lives Matter wants real substantive change, not just in police action, but in social structures. And so often, the public displays of listening amount to people kneeling or taking down statues, symbolic things that don't really change those structures.
Yeah. I think, as always, Bruce is right on and thoughtful in his comments.
I've really struggled with this myself. I'm from the South. I grew up in Louisiana, so I have some experience of what it's like in places where you will see Confederate monuments and flags everywhere. And I have been concerned about the movement to pull things down simply because I think of it as symbolic, and I know that so many people are not aware of the historical origins of those statues and what they can mean, and will, out of ignorance, perhaps be simply attached to the idea of it being culture or a cultural icon. And so then the problem is when you pull it down, you lose insofar as it's only a symbolic change and not the substantive change that Bruce calls for, but you also polarize, you alienate a group. It's really hard to see how to ameliorate that tension, I guess, between groups, especially with regard to racism, because everyone has got biases in them in some way. And anything that you do that creates polarization and makes a person feel like they're part of the group which is behaving negatively, that creates an isolation. Somehow the substantive change has to be inclusive. It's for me, it's a paradox that a lot of the efforts to try to generate inclusivity actually isolate the people whose minds that you want to change. And it's a lot of it, some of the most effective modalities that I've seen are really about understanding. And again, going back to communication, there's an amazing video that my wife and I watched with our kids on Frontline, A Class Divided, which I think a lot of people know about, where Jane Elliott did this famous experiment, I guess in the 70s, with a 3rd or 4th grade class and divided them in terms of blue eyes and brown eyes, and watched organically how racism manifests in that group from such an artificial division. For me, just watching that, as opposed to discussing racism or identifying icons of racism and elements like the Confederate flag, just watching that was incredibly powerful and eye-opening. And I felt like the experience was in some way revealing and more inclusive than a lot of things that happen, which amount to listening, as Bruce said, but not necessarily substantive change. I think this is going to be a very defining moment in our time in terms of how we figure out how to deal with that and get to the substantive change that Bruce calls for.
Yeah, I completely agree. I got caught up with the word symbolic that Bruce used too, because I don't want to let go of the power of symbolic change, whether that's symbolic violence or symbolic moments, or I think that those efforts, scaffold or coupled with the more on the ground critical work that you both are describing now. But I think the symbolism has a role to play. And I think this comes back to discussions I've been listening to about the place of rioting and looting, right? There's been some have seen it as a distraction from the movements, and others have seen it as essential, like an essential piece of what's happening. And again, I'm out of my element here, but I think it's the power of the symbolic can't be overlooked. I think the symbolic moments of taking down statues, or even the symbolic moment of kneeling, done by the right person in the right context in the right moment, can have a powerful impact in bolstering what's already going on. We've got 5 minutes, and I know folks have got other things going on today. So I'm happy to take other questions, and I wanted to make sure I thank everybody for both being here and for participating in the conversation. This was a lot of fun, as always, and I hope you'll stay in touch with us. Victoria is going to put up a final slide that has our contact information on it, so you can track us down. I mentioned the Ethics Ambassadors program that's open to anybody, faculty, staff, student. We'll try to get back to regular meetings here towards the end of the summer and into the fall. So you can reach out to us at the email address below. You can find more about us on our website. You'll see that website coming online with more content and news stories coming up in the next couple of weeks, if I can get my act together. And there's a whole bunch of other really fun things going on. So please do stay in touch with us. You can find us online, find our email addresses online at any point. You can reach out to us at this email address. So thank you all, everybody, for being here. This was a lot of fun. And thank you for the College of Arts and Humanities for putting it on and for inviting us.
Thank you. I'll add my thanks. Thank you very much, everybody.